More than 50 years ago, the world was plunged into a cataclysm of world war. A war far greater, far more costly in terms of lives and resources than any previous conflict. It profoundly affected the world we live in, and the effects continue up until this very day. The Second World War was the largest and the most intensive conflict the world has ever known. And for many people, that period of bloody conflict will remain as the most important period for the rest of their lives. Today, there is still a generation alive who fought the war firsthand. Another generation was born during it. To subsequent generations, it is merely history. Throughout the course of the war, conflict raged in almost every corner of the world. Battles and subsequent victories and losses that are now famous in the annals of history. No one force could claim the glory in ending the conflict, and we are forever indebted to the heroism of individuals. For jointly, the Allied forces not only put a stop to Hitler and the threat of the mighty German jackboot, but also to the threat of the imperialistic Japanese advancing through the Pacific territories. This film is dedicated to one of those forces, the largest air force the world has ever seen, the United States Air Force. In December 1940, President Roosevelt, bathing in the victory of the presidential election the month before, gave his end-of-year speech. He warned America of the four basic freedoms that were at stake in the war in Europe: freedom of speech, religion, want, and fear. The American people, although having great admiration for the way Britain was standing up to the Axis power, were still not really ready to go to war. However, events over the following months changed the course of American history. On June 21st, 1941, the United States Army Air Forces were created to bring together the Army Air Corps and the GHQ Air Force under one supreme command. And the effects of the past 2 years' expansion plan were beginning to show. Manpower had risen from just over 9,000 to over 140,000, and the inventory on aircraft stood at 6,102. Although these figures seemed impressive, they were well below the planned totals. And the conduct of war in Europe was highlighting the inadequacy of U.S. air defense. Throughout 1941, President Roosevelt continued helping the British war machine. The Lend-Lease aid was agreed, whereby Britain and China would receive material aid which would be repaid in kind at the end of the war. America's involvement in the war became an increasingly foregone conclusion. U.S. shipping was being attacked by German U-boats. Japan demanded a cessation of U.S. aid to China. The U.S. froze all Japanese assets after the Japanese had moved into South Indochina, taking this as an act of aggression on the part of the Japanese. Japanese responded by announcing that they would be fully prepared for war by October 1941. Although at this time they were not really ready to go to war, on the 26th of November, the U.S. government demanded outright Japanese withdrawal from China, the same day as the Japanese fleet set sail. Before the end of 1941, the American people were going to receive a devastating shock. And in Britain, Winston Churchill's prayers were about to be answered. The bomb-raged cities of war-torn Europe could hardly have seemed further away when the men and women of Hawaii woke to a beautiful Sunday morning. Yet within hours, the very heart would be ripped out of not just the islands, but the nation itself. The date was December 7th, 1941. The place, Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had been exercising at sea during the past week, but returned to port for the weekend. All units were in harbor, apart from the carriers Lexington and Enterprise, which were transporting additional aircraft to the U.S. detachments in Wake and Midway Islands. At 06:15 hours, local time, the first wave of Japanese aircraft took off from their carriers positioned some 200 miles north of Hawaii. 15 minutes later, the U.S. destroyer Ward spotted a midget submarine at the port entrance to Pearl Harbor. It was one of 5 that the Japanese had planned to send into Pearl Harbor, and Ward quickly engaged and sank her. At 07:50 hours, the first wave of Japanese aircraft, some 43 fighters, 51 dive bombers, 70 torpedo bombers, and 50 ordinary bombers, appeared over Pearl Harbor. They attacked the airfields at Wheeler, Kano, Iwa, and Hickam, and launched torpedoes at the serried ranks of warships anchored in Battleship Row. Surprise was complete. Within minutes, some 5 battleships, 2 light cruisers, and an old target battleship had been totally destroyed. A second wave of over 170 Japanese aircraft appeared an hour later, but this time the U.S. defenses were a little better prepared. Nevertheless, the Japanese damaged another battleship and wrecked 3 more destroyers. By 1000 hours, it was all over. The 2 waves of carrier-based Japanese aircraft had wreaked havoc on the Pacific Fleet, leaving flaming hulks of once proud ships in their wake. 63 U.S. aircraft had been lost to the attackers. Almost all of the U.S. aircraft on the ground at the time of the attack had been wiped out. The United States of America was now at war. The war in Europe had become global. On the 8th of December, 1941, the USA and Britain declared war on Japan. On the 11th of December, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. The great American war machine was now going to be put to the test. Although the American aircraft industry was turning out aircraft and spares for the Allies fighting in Europe and North Africa, in the 2 years leading up to entering the war, the United States had made very little progress in the development of fighter aircraft. In December 1941, they were ill-prepared for the war that lay ahead. For the most part, the squadrons of United States Army Air Forces had to rely on aircraft that had been designed and built up to 10 or more years before. In 1931, when the P-26 had been introduced into service, it had been heralded as a brand new concept in fighter design, being the first all-metal and the first monoplane fighter to enter squadron service. The P-26, or the P-Shooter, as it was known, was the last production fighter to be manufactured by Boeing, powered by a 600-horsepower Pratt & Whitney Wasp engine. She was capable of speeds up to 234 miles per hour over a range of 560 miles. The P-26 had fixed landing gear with heavy, high-drag wheel pants. The fuselage was covered in bracing wires and armed with only two 7.62 millimeter guns or one 12.7 millimeter machine gun. Its armament could have been described as somewhat inadequate for World War II combat. By the late 1930s, the P-26 was replaced by the P-35 and the P-36. The Seversky P-35 was introduced into service in 1936 as a major step forward into the world of fighter construction. The P-35 was the first single-seater, all-metal pursuit plane with a retractable undercarriage. Powered by a 1,050-horsepower Pratt & Whitney air-cooled engine, the P-35 was able to fly at speeds of 310 miles per hour over a range of 950 miles, with a maximum ceiling of 31,400 feet. However, the initial period of excitement over the introduction of the P-35 was short-lived. American pilots in the P-35 found that they simply could not stay with or effectively fight the Japanese fighters that swarmed down on them. As other monoplanes became readily available, the overall shortcomings of this fighter became apparent. Needless to say, it was rejected by the Royal Air Force. It was soon too apparent that this was not the fighter that was going to win the war. Seversky of Farmingdale in Long Island later emerged as the famous Republic aircraft manufacturer, which went on to produce many well-known and well-proven fighters. It soon became clear that the key to winning the war would depend a great deal on the readiness of America. The United States Army Air Force was born into a tumultuous world with a mandate of rapid expansion in terms of both men and airplanes. This meant that thousands and ultimately hundreds of thousands of new pilots would have to be trained practically overnight. The key aircraft in this expansion was neither a fighter nor a bomber. It was the trainer that was going to make it possible to fly the fighters and the bombers. The AT-6 was going to be the keystone of what was to become the largest air force the world would ever see. The North American AT-6 Texan, or Harbour, as it was known in England, was originally built of aluminum construction. But because of the ever-increasing need for this material by aviation companies, it was decided to preserve the resources of aluminum for the construction of combat aircraft. The early Texans, the AT-6Cs, were built from plywood, and this model was immediately followed by the AT-6D. Both types were fitted with 600-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engines and were capable of top speeds around 210 miles per hour at 24,000 feet over a maximum range of 750 miles. They were also fitted with two 30-caliber machine guns. Though most of the Texans were only armed for training purposes, a handful were designated as fighters for combat duty. In fact, in July 1942, one of a group of United States Army Air Force Texans sent to Mexico scored 2 direct hits on a German submarine. Throughout the war, the Texans saw many new marks being introduced, and it was used in almost every theater of war. Dependability and durability were only 2 of the aircraft's assets. An example of the kind of wear and tear to which the Texan was subjected is shown in the history of an AT-6 at Craig Field. The logs show that it flew over 2,000 hours, was involved in no less than 11 crack-ups, had 7 new wings, 5 new landing gear struts, and 6 propellers. During one particular period, the aircraft was in the air for 22 hours a day. Easy to maintain and repair, it could do anything a fighter could do, only not as fast. It had more maneuverability and was easier to handle, a pilot's aircraft. Designed to give the best possible training in all types of tactics, from ground strafing to bombardment to aerial dogfighting, she was possibly the best trainer in the world. The Texan carried versatile equipment such as bomb racks, blind flying instrumentation, gun and standard cameras, fixed and flexible guns, and just about every other device that a military pilot would have to operate. At the end of the war, many of the Texans were scrapped and others were sold off. Some were retained, however, to train post-war pilots. In 1947, when the United States Army Air Force became the United States Air Force, the Texan AT-6 was redesignated the T-6, and some of them even served in Korea as spotter planes for fighter bombers. The Texan has been called the most universally used plane in history. Now, while that may be an exaggeration, she was possibly the most universally used trainer ever built.
I flew the AT-6 in Arizona, Luke Field, Arizona, and it was quite an experience compared to the previous training planes. It was the first training plane with the retractable landing gear and actual machine guns and dropping bombs, all simulated, of course. It was quite an experience.
Up until the entry of America into the war, the U.S. had been supplying the RAF with one of their most advanced fighters of the time. The P-40, or the Tomahawk, as it was known in England. The P-40 had begun life as the P-36, which had been redesignated with a new power plant, the Allison V-1710. This engine, however, proved to be ineffective at altitude, and with other fighter designs coming off the drawing boards that showed much more promise, the P-40 was not deemed worth the improvement of a new turbocharged power plant. Although during World War II, the P-40 fought in just about every theater of war, once the pilots flew above 15,000 feet, the aircraft was inferior to just about all of the Axis fighters. The Allison-powered P-40 was capable of top speeds in excess of 340 miles per hour, and with auxiliary fuel carried, had a range of 1,080 miles. The P-40 ranks as the third most numerous of the United States Army Air Force fighters, with some 13,800 airframes being manufactured throughout World War II. Along with the P-26, the P-40 was also caught on the ground during the Pearl Harbor attack. And although there were a number of enemy strikes from those that managed to get airborne, the P-40s were one of the heaviest casualties. There were many forces during the war flying P-40s. One of the most famous groups was the American Volunteer Group. The Flying Tigers, as they were designated, were probably the most famous, and their heroic exploits have gone down in the annals of history. A milestone in the P-40's war career came in 1941 when a British-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was installed in a new Mark, the P-40F, which the United States Army Air Force designated the Warhawk, and the British version, the Kitty Hawk. This allowed the aircraft greater speeds of up to 370 miles per hour. In some respects, a classic. The P-40 is no doubt remembered with fondness as a tough and reliable mount, able to absorb and inflict punishment, and always effective in air-to-ground roles, but never at any time as a candidate for the greatness that was achieved by some of the later United States Army Air Force fighters. First flown on the 6th of April, 1938, the Bell P-39 Air Cobra, outwardly conventional in appearance, was unique in fighter design in having the power plant located behind the pilot. The Air Cobra was also the first fighter with the United States Army Air Force to have a retractable tricycle undercarriage and a heavy nose-mounted cannon. Powered by an Allison 1200 horsepower engine, the P-39 was capable of top speeds around 386 miles per hour over a range of 650 miles. They served worldwide, yet never felt the touch of greatness. If the United States Army Air Force was going to play a serious role in defeating the German and the Japanese air forces, they were going to need aircraft that could at least match the enemy. One of those aircraft was the P-38, the Lockheed Lightning, or the Fork-tailed Devil, as it became known to the enemy. The Lightning served with the United States Army Air Force on every battlefront in a wide variety of roles, ranging from fighter-bomber to casualty evacuation and smoke laying. If slightly slower and less maneuverable than its counterparts, the Lightning offered the advantage of twin-engine operation with its added safety factor and excellent combat range. Powered by two 1,600 horsepower Allison engines, which could take the Lightning up to speeds of 414 miles per hour and over a distance of 450 miles, but with a maximum range of 2,600 miles, the Lightning was the first twin-boom configuration to be adopted by the United States Army Air Force and their first twin-engine single-seat fighter. By the end of 1944, there were 13 operational groups of P-38s with the United States Army Air Force, serving as long-range fighter escorts and ground attack aircraft for the 9th Air Force in Europe. While in the Pacific, their long range put them in the forefront of the island-hopping campaign. The first bomber escort missions to Berlin were mounted by Lightnings. And in the Pacific, the Lightnings claimed more Japanese aircraft than any other fighter. The leading American fighter ace of World War II, the late Major Richard Bong, scored all 40 of his kills in a Lightning P-38. Closely followed by Major Thomas McGuire, who scored 38 kills flying a Lightning. Both of these pilots won the Medal of Honor. After a successful combat career, fittingly, a Lightning was the first Allied aircraft to land in Japan after VJ Day, an appropriate finale for one of the great aircraft of the war. With Europe seen as the principal theater of operations, It came as no surprise when the United States Army Air Force sent the majority of its aircraft to RAF stations in England to begin combat operations against the Luftwaffe. Now, this buildup of forces, however, took some considerable time. It was not until the 25th of June, 1942, that the first combat sortie was flown, although some U.S. B-24 bombers had flown from Egypt to bomb Ploesti on the 11th of June, these being the first U.S. bombs to fall on Europe. In January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group arrived in the United Kingdom at RAF Halesworth with the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. RAF fighter pilots banteringly suggested that their American counterparts would be able to take evasive action from enemy gunfire when attacked by undoing their harnesses and dodging around the fuselage of their huge mounts. The Thunderbolt was certainly big. In fact, it was the largest and the heaviest single-engine, single-seater fighter that had ever been built. But sheer size was not to prove detrimental during World War II to the Thunderbolt's operational career. During the period from March 1943 up until August 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt flew on over 540,000 combat sorties. A misconception about the P-47 involved its unofficial nickname, Jug. Most people think that it was because the Thunderbolt was a juggernaut amongst fighters, although indeed it was. But the name actually came from the fact that the cavernous fuselage resembled a moonshiner's whiskey jug. When the Thunderbolts joined the United States Army Air Force fighter groups in England, the pilots who had been used to the Spitfire found them to be heavy, unresponsive, and unmaneuverable. Radio chatter was drowned out by the noise of the 2,535 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine. But these teething problems were gradually overcome, and it was soon found that the Thunderbolt, with its combined toughness and enormous firepower from the 8 12.7 millimeter machine guns, could give a good account of itself.
The primary thought in your mind was the target. You had to find the target after you peel off. You had to seek the target, and then aim at it, drop your bomb, shoot the guns as you're going down. You figure somebody down there is shooting up at you, so you might as well shoot down at them. And you peel off. You try to look back and see what your bomb did, but by that time you're half blacked out from the G-force. And then you reform in formation, and then come back down to the deck, and spread out in echelon, and just fly along treetop level, and anything that moves, you shoot at it. Looking for convoys, looking for any kind of tanks, trucks, railroads. And when you shoot those 850 caliber guns, you got an awful lot of bullets going out.
In Europe, from D-Day to VE Day, the Thunderbolt proved its air-to-ground prowess by accounting for 86,000 railway wagons, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 tanks, and 68,000 trucks. According to one figure, Thunderbolts in action shot down no fewer than 3,916 enemy aircraft, once again proving the Thunderbolt's staying power, durability, and stability as a gun platform. The Thunderbolt was by no means perfect. Its takeoff run was unduly long, the cockpit was uncomfortable, and its turning power in close maneuvering dogfights was poor. But ask any pilot of the day, which was your own personal favorite aircraft? He was bound to tell you, the one that brings you home.
In certain circumstances, if it had been any other airplane, I wouldn't be here to talk about it. The P-47 brought pilots back with half their wings shot off, and the fuel pumps shot to pieces, parts of the engine shot to pieces, and for some reason or other, the airplane just kept flying.
Despite the considerable success of the Thunderbolt, and the veritable wall of defensive fire thrown up by the bomber formations, there were appalling losses. Tactical mistakes led to occasions where bombers were left unprotected, and the Luftwaffe lost no time in taking full advantage. The Thunderbolt, although being able to protect the bombers for most of their mission, even with the addition of the underbody fuel tank, were unable to offer enough range for complete protection. Well, by the end of October 1943, bomber losses were huge, and the need for a fighter that could cover the entire raid was painfully obvious. Mass operations over Europe were largely suspended by the Air Force pending a solution to the problem. And that solution was at hand in the form of the North American P-51 Mustang. Of the great superiority fighters of World War II, there is probably none that has earned more votes for best of its genre than the Mustang. Arriving relatively late to the war, it really began its illustrious career after the venerable Spitfires, Thunderbolts, Messerschmitt 109s, Lightnings, Zeros had established their reputations. The P-51 was the long-awaited, long-range fighter escort for the American strategic bombers penetrating the heart of the German Reich. The first Allied fighter to pose a serious threat to Nazi interceptors in the skies over the fatherland itself. In the Pacific, the Mustangs swarmed into Iwo Jima after its capture and used the former Japanese stronghold as a base from which to seize air superiority over the Japanese home islands. The P-51D, which was the most numerous and the best known of all the Mustang variants, was fitted with a 1,590 horsepower Packard Merlin engine, which generated a top speed of 448 miles per hour with the ability to fly over enemy territory up to 1,300 miles away from its base. The North American Mustang was born almost by mistake. The Royal Air Force, on a buying mission to the USA, requested that the company, North American, open a production line to build for them, under license, Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. North American decided that they could offer one better by offering their own design, which evolved into the P-51. On its arrival into the European theater of war in October 1943, Mustang was saddled with the stigma of being an attack plane. It was intended that the 354th Fighter Group should be assigned to the 9th Air Force as an England-based group flying tactical fighter-bomber operations. However, as luck would have it, the 354th was still under the control of the 8th Air Force, so the Mustangs were immediately pressed into service as long-range fighter escorts for the B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers that the 8th was sending against strategic targets deep inside Germany. On the 13th of December 1943, the P-51Bs accompanied 649 heavy bombers to the U-boat pens at Kiel. Well, this attack brought the first of many such surprises for the Nazi interceptors. 3 days later, a United States Army Air Force Mustang downed a German fighter for the first time, the first of many. On January 5th, Mustang scored kills on no less than 18 enemy aircraft in one raid. The great American test pilot Chuck Yeager flew the Mustang all over Europe, calling it the best American fighter in the war and equal to anything the Germans could put up against her. A strange variant of the P-51 Mustang was the F-82 Twin Mustang, built by combining two P-51 Mustangs into one single aircraft. The P-51 ended the war as the cream of the United States Army Air Forces fighters, if not the top fighter of the war. When finally the last Mustang was retired from U.S. services in 1957, the Mustang, which had been conceived almost by mistake, was in its own right and amongst the pilots that flew it, a legend. No account of military aircraft during World War II would be complete without including the shipborne fighters of the U.S. Navy. The greatest accolade of fighter construction for U.S. naval service would have to go to Grumman and Grumman Cats. The Grumman Wildcat was the Navy's standard single-seat fighter when the U.S. entered the war in 1941, and she remained so well into the first half of the Pacific conflict. Not only was the Wildcat the first really successful Allied shipboard fighter monoplane, but it also was the first fighter in the world to enter service with a two-stage supercharged engine. From a performance aspect, the Wildcat was an undistinguished warplane, and in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability, the Wildcat was markedly inferior to its principal opponent, the Zero. But it compensated to some extent for these shortcomings with its tractability, sturdy structure, superior firepower, and internal protection. The American pilots soon proved themselves adept in turning the Wildcat's strong points against the enemy's weaknesses. And if the Wildcat, when expertly flown, was a fair match for the Zero, then its successor, the F-6F Hellcat, was the Zero's nemesis. This was Grumman's first fighter plane that had been conceived, developed, and built after the war had begun, thereby incorporating into the design all of the lessons learned from combat not only in the Pacific, but also from the European theater of war. The Hellcat was unquestionably the most important shipboard fighter of the Second World War. And to this aircraft, more than to any other, went the distinction of turning the tide in the air war over the Pacific. The Hellcat was twice as powerful as the Zero. It had a higher maximum speed. It could outclimb, outdive, and outgun it. And it retained all the benefits of its predecessors, the Wildcat, with its benefits of high structural strength, armor plating, and self-sealing fuel tanks. In fact, during combat, with the exception of turning radius and range, the Hellcat completely outperformed the Zero. When production of this magnificent fighter ended in 1945, no less than 12,274 airframes had been in service. The combat record of the Hellcat was outstanding. They were credited with 4/5 of the total score of carrier-based fighters, amounting to no less than 5,000 Japanese airplanes shot down by Hellcats in air combat. David McCampbell, the U.S. Navy's highest-scoring ace, accounted for 15 Japanese airplanes definitely destroyed by his Hellcat out of an incoming force that numbered more than 100. There were other cats from the Grumman stable of much lesser fame than the Wildcat and the Hellcat. The F-7F Tiger Cat, intended first as a ground attack machine and then as a night fighter, unfortunately getting nowhere significant as either, like most aircraft whose role changed in mid-development. And then there was the F-8F Bearcat, brought into service too late for a combat career, but a definite candidate for one of the ultimate piston-engine fighters of the day. The Bearcat could fly at 500 miles per hour at 13,000 feet and had a higher initial rate of climb than any other fighter, including contemporary jets. As with the Mustang, most of the variants that survive today are privately owned and are flown successfully in air races. While the Hellcat was the mainstay of U.S. carrier aviation, its counterpart, the Corsair F-4U, was the mainstay of the Navy's shore-based fighter elements. The two fighters often worked hand in hand. When the Hellcats had secured shore bases, the Corsair took over, The two fighters became known as the Terrible Twins. The Corsair was another famous U.S. aircraft that could join the bidding for the finest single-seater fighter to emerge from World War II. She was the sweetheart of Okinawa to the Marine Corps, the whistling death to the Japanese, and the bent-winged bird to the American ground forces which it protected in the Pacific. Despite its formidable quality, however, and the fact that it was expressly designed for shipboard operations, the Corsair spent most of its service confined to land-based operations. The Corsair pilots forged their aircraft into an air supremacy weapon, meeting the Japanese Zero-Sen fighters head-on, and for the first time on more than equal terms, smashing them into the sea and jungle alike, which in turn helped turn the tide of air combat permanently in favor of the Allied forces. After the war, the Chance Vort Corsair was to enjoy a distinguished post-war career, the highlight of which was the Korean campaign, its first-line service stretching into the 60s. Introduced into combat during the Battle of Midway in June 1942 was the Grumman TBF Avenger. They had been introduced to replace the Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. Unfortunately, the start to their combat career was not an illustrious one. When 6 took off from Midway Island on the 4th of June 1942, only one was to return, limping back home with only its trim tab to provide longitudinal control, the torpedo doors and one wheel hanging down, one gunner dead, and one wounded. But although the Avenger began its career on a bleak note, that condition very soon improved. The Avenger was soon destined to become the scourge of the Japanese shipping. The most famous pilot of an Avenger was President George Bush, who at 18 was the youngest pilot in the U.S. Navy. It was in an Avenger that the president was to be shot down later in his career. Once this aircraft had made its mark, orders for production rapidly increased, and Grumman, already under pressure to produce the Hellcat series, became overloaded. General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division was called in to fill the orders and to augment the Grumman production line. The Eastern-built Avenger was designated the TBM Avenger. In total, 9,836 Avengers were produced, and these aircraft served a variety of combat roles, from torpedo bomber to reconnaissance weather observation. They were also the pathfinders for the U.S. Navy's ever more sophisticated anti-submarine warfare effort. Avengers served on active duty until they were finally retired in 1954. There were many other aircraft that served with the Air Forces during this war period. All of them deserve a place of honor. The Navy also flew the Grumman Tracker. Now, this aircraft was operated from aircraft carriers in the Pacific on anti-submarine patrols. The Douglas SBD Dauntless had been the mainstay of the Navy's dive-bombing operations and had done a great deal in tipping the scales in favor of the U.S. during the war in the Pacific. The Dauntless was a tough and accurate dive bomber, capable of carrying a 1,000-pound bomb at speeds of 260 miles per hour over a range of 1,230 miles. The United States Army Air Force also needed aircraft which would act as transport planes. One of the perhaps lesser famous of these is the consolidated C-46. Another, the C-123 Provider, with its huge cavernous belly and a real workhorse, was used extensively in the Vietnam War. At the end of World War II, General Dwight Eisenhower, and you can see here the actual Lockheed Constellation that was his personal aircraft during the war years, made a statement that included, along with the Jeep, the bazooka, and the atom bomb, the Douglas C-47 as the 4 weapons that had most helped win the war. The C-47, or the Goonie Bird as it's known in America, or the Dakota in England, had been in use since 3 years before the war and is still in use today in some parts of the world. One pilot's description read, "The Goonie Bird protested, she rattled, she leaked oil, she ran hot, she ran cold, and she ran rough." On hot days, it staggered along and scared you half to death, its wings flexing and twisting in a horrifying manner. It sank back to earth with a sigh of relief. But she flew, and she flew, and she flew. The Goonie would take us to wherever we had to go and brought us back home again, honest, faithful, and magnificent machine that she was.
Personally, I first checked out in the Dakota back there in I think it was January of 1943, and I was still flying them in Vietnam in 1968 and 69, so I have a substantial number of hours in that airplane also. But the Dakota is an extremely safe airplane. It's not an airplane that would kill a pilot. The C-46 would if you weren't careful. It's a higher operational facilities that it has.
Long before the war had started, the United States Army Air Force had long been interested in strategic bombing. Well, by the time the war started, the United States already led the world in the development of fast monoplane bombers, capable of carrying large loads over long ranges. One aircraft that was already in service was one which was to gain the accolade of being the most celebrated aircraft operated by the United States during the conflict. Very few other aircraft gained as much affection from the public and from their aircrew as did the Boeing B-17. This magnificent aircraft was powered by 4 Wright Cyclone engines with General Electric superchargers, each one capable of delivering 1,200 horsepower during takeoff and 1,380 horsepower under war emergency conditions at 26,700 feet. She had a maximum speed of 300 miles per hour at 30,000 feet and a maximum continuous speed of 263 miles per hour at 27,000 feet. The B-17G was fitted with 13 Browning machine guns in the chin, the nose, tail, the dorsal, the central fuselage, the ventral, the waist, and tail positions with a short-range bomb load of 17,600 pounds. Armed with a 4,000-pound bomb load, the B-17 could fly over a range of 1,850 miles.
I was very lucky, the way I remember it. He was out at least about 1,000 yards, which is about the limit of our guns. But I wasn't going to take any chances on him getting close to us because he might get us first. So he was traveling in the same direction, and he decided to make a move on us. So he turned in towards us, and as he did that, I gave out with a burst, and maybe another burst or so, and all of a sudden it just blew up. And others said they saw it and all, and I was the only one firing, so I got credit for it. But Louis, I'd like to talk about him because he was really something. He was a crack shot. He was a farmer from Connecticut, and still is for that matter. And when we were in training, at one point they let us shoot 12-gauge shotguns, and the instructor was telling him how to shoot. Well, he knew how to shoot because he always shot rabbits and what have you. And anyhow, he had the gun down by his waist like that, waiting for instructions. And somebody goofed, and they let the high house and the low house come out with the skeet, you know. And without even thinking, there was no time for him to lift it up to his shoulder and shoot. So he just waved around like that, bang, bang, and he had them both down. The instructor bawled him out and said, "That's no way to shoot." But that's, you know, his name was Kiss. There's a reason for me telling you that. After he shot down the 2 or 3 fighters I mentioned, they painted on the tail of the plane a kiss in the ass.
The Fortress was a sturdy aircraft whose extensively convoluted construction allowed one structural member to assume the stresses of a neighboring member if that piece happened to be shot away. The Fortress could take a tremendous amount of battle damage and still remain flying. Spanning over 100 feet and weighing more than 30 tons, she was a large warbird for her day. This size also made her a large target for the fighters of the Luftwaffe. Machine gun fire the B-17 could stand, but heavy rockets and cannon shells went through like a knife through butter. In 1943, the Fortress suffered heavy losses, and those losses became colossal by the end of that year when the Germans pulled back their fighters to defend the fatherland. They could put up waves of fighters against the incoming attacks by the B-17s at a rate of 1,000 a time. In Germany, fighter production was up to 1,000 a month. The United States Army Air Force lost 120% of its complement of B-17s inside 4 months. A bomber cruise tour was 25 missions. With 1 in 10 aircraft being shot down on every mission, they were on borrowed time if they lasted beyond the first 10. Early in 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps drew up a requirement for a heavy bomber of infinitely greater performance than the B-17. They were looking for a bomber with a greatly improved range and with a top speed in excess of 300 miles per hour and a ceiling of 35,000 feet. The Consolidated Corporation of San Diego came up with just such a bomber, the B-24 Liberator. Although the Liberator enjoyed a much shorter operational career, it was much more versatile than its rival, the B-17, and made a tremendous contribution toward winning the war. No other American aircraft was built in greater numbers or saw such widespread service. The Liberator could not carry the bomb load of the Flying Fortress, but it did have distinct aerodynamic advantages. A tricycle undercarriage and wings of a very high aspect ratio. The first of these advantages making takeoff and landings considerably easier. The second produced a high lift for the minimum amount of drag, resulting in excellent overall performance. The Liberator also possessed an autopilot, allowing the aircraft to make full advantage of its long range as a maritime reconnaissance bomber. By comparison with the Fortress, the Liberator was indeed an ugly duckling, with its deep slab-sided fuselage and immense barn door-like vertical tail surfaces. Features which are hardly an indication of speed and agility, but one of the prime virtues of the Liberator, and indeed one which invariably hallmarks a great warplane, was its versatility. In addition to being a strategic bomber, it was used with equal facility for maritime reconnaissance and anti-submarine operations, passenger and freight transportation, as a flying tanker, and for photographic reconnaissance. It was this quality which largely accounted for the extraordinary total of 18,188 variants being produced for the United States Army Air Force since they introduced it into service in 1941. The Liberator had also shown solid service with the Royal Air Force and other Allied forces. When the Allied forces were carrying out the long-range bombing attacks in Europe without escort fighter cover, the German fighters very soon found the Liberator's most vulnerable point. The same weak spot was evident in the B-17, the nose section, and they were attacked head-on, resulting in the late variants being fitted with an improved motor-driven nose turret and modified machine guns. The Liberator was about to be declared operational when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The United States immediately held back delivery of some Liberators bound for Great Britain, and the type was pressed into service as quickly as possible. Production was stepped up. The first operational sortie was flown by the United States Army Air Force in January of 1942 from the island of Java in the Pacific. The British Liberators had been flying operationally during 1941. By the middle of 1942, Liberators were seeing operational service in the Pacific, Europe, Alaska, India, and the Middle East. It was decided during this year, however, to concentrate Liberator activities on the Pacific, where their long-range autopilot capability and reliability was to prove invaluable. In Europe, the B-24s joined the B-17s with the 8th Air Force and at first operated in mixed formations with the larger numbers of fortresses. The abortive rate was high, but they continued attacks on U-boat pens and on submarine patrols. Eventually, a complete air division of Liberators was formed and continued completing some spectacular attacks against Axis targets. The most sensational of these, perhaps, being the second strike on the Ploesti oil fields on August the 1st, 1943. As is well known, this raid turned out as something of a catastrophe for the United States Army Air Force, despite damage caused to the target. Out of 177 Liberators that set out, 57 were lost, mostly to the intense ground fire, and it was some time before the survivors could be reassembled as an effective force. This Liberator, the All-American, one of the only two remaining in flying condition, is a fine tribute to the brave crews and to an outstanding aircraft. Whether the material to be delivered happened to be bombs, depth charges, gasoline, freight, troops, or VIPs, the Liberator established a reputation second to none for doing almost any job, anywhere. On the 20th of June, 1941, the Air Corps had become the United States Army Air Force, a service with a mandate to build the largest air force on Earth. One bomber variant was destined to play a key role in that massive expansion plan, the North American B-25 Mitchell. Whilst the North American production lines were gearing up for mass production of B-25s, the United States Army Air Force had earmarked this two-engine mid-range bomber for what was to become one of the most important missions of the war. The position in the Pacific was desperate. The Japanese, having destroyed a large part of the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor, had overrun Southeast Asia and the Philippines and had captured Singapore. They had also occupied parts of Alaska and now threatened Australia and America's west coast. The Japanese appeared invincible, ruling the Pacific as though it were a Japanese lake. In Washington, D.C., however, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had dreamed up an incredible, almost an absurd plan. They wanted to bomb Tokyo immediately. It seemed impossible. No airplane in the world could fly even half the range needed. Normal carrier-based planes could not get close enough without the carriers coming under heavy attack. A long-range bomber couldn't be used as it needed a runway longer than a carrier's deck. And what was needed was a mid-range bomber that could take off from a carrier outside of the patrol radius of Japanese shores. The B-25 was that bomber. Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, a well-respected pilot, was assigned the task of mounting a raid. On the 18th of April, 1942, after weeks of practice, despite heavy seas, 16 B-25s managed to take off from the carrier USS Hornet. All 16 planes reached their target and dropped their bomb loads, some 16 tons. Whilst the Mitchell was entering service in the Pacific theater of war, the B-24 Liberators, having proved themselves as the heavy long-range bombers over the European theater, were now going to give way in the Pacific for the advent of the Air Force's new mid-range bomber. The B-25 Mitchell, named after Colonel Billy Mitchell, had entered service in a baptism of fire. Had the Mitchell never made another attack, it would have now ranked as one of the most truly historic aircraft of the war. But it was to make many more attacks and was to find a place in almost every theater of the war. The B-25 was manufactured in larger quantities than any other twin-engined American bomber, serving not only with the United States Army Air Force, but also with the British, Soviet, and Allied forces. Although they carried a modest bomb load compared to the Fortress and Liberators, their speed, maneuverability, and ability to be able to fly at very low levels made them potent weapons indeed when they used to strafe enemy targets with their 50 caliber machine guns. The later variants were fitted with even heavier gun power, 75mm guns augmented by 4 nose-mounted and 4 side-mounted 50 caliber machine guns, as well as a top turret, 2 waist guns, and a tail turret. When World War II ended, the North American B-25 Mitchell had earned a justifiably important place in the history of combat aircraft. The sister aircraft of the B-25 was the Martin B-26 Marauder. This aircraft was introduced into service in 1941, claimed by the press to be a flying torpedo because of its almost perfectly streamlined circular fuselage. On its introduction, the B-26 earned other, less distinguished accolades as widowmaker and flying prostitute when its lethal flying characteristics were discovered. It was almost taken out of service, but after modifications to the type and after its pilots became used to its unforgiving flying characteristics, the B-26 went on to come into its own at the closing stages of the war, and its losses were proportionately lower than any other U.S. combat type. The lines and sleek appearance were also apparent in the development of the A-26, which was later again designated the B-26 Invader. B-17 was described as one of the most terrible weapons of war ever unleashed because of the damage it reaped on German cities. Even so, 1/3 of all the B-17s produced went down, and losses in killed, wounded, taken prisoner, or simply missing totaled nearly 100,000 men. The aircraft that was to supersede the B-17 at the latter end of the war was an aircraft that came from the same stable, Boeing, an aircraft that was to wreak similar devastation and carnage on the cities of Japan. The Boeing B-29 Super Fortress. This aircraft fulfilled the wishes of the United States Army Air Force for a bomber that could carry substantial bomb loads at high speeds over considerable distances at high altitudes. When in 1943 the first B-29s entered service, it was decided that they would not be used against targets in Europe, but they would concentrate instead on bombing the cities of Japan, in which the pressurized cabins and great range of the B-29s would prove most useful. The famous island hopping campaign conducted in the Pacific by the Allied forces was undertaken largely to secure bases for the superfortress operations against the Japanese homelands. After a relative lack of success with high explosive bombs, a series of raids with incendiary devices proved far more successful, devastating vast areas of Japanese cities. Yet despite the carnage wreaked on their people, the Japanese refused to surrender. Whilst the B-29 Superfortress had proved to be a complete success and had gained a place in the history books, there was going to be a mission that would close the history books on World War II forever. On the 6th of August, 1945, at 02:45 hours, Colonel Paul Tibbets took off in a B-29. The crews had some indication of the load they were carrying and knew it was a special weapon, but they did not know its precise nature. Colonel Tibbets' aircraft was the Enola Gay. The bomb load, Little Boy, a cylindrical device measuring 129 inches in length by 31.5 inches in diameter, weighing 9,700 pounds, containing 137.3 pounds of uranium-235, the atom bomb, and the target, Hiroshima. The bomb was released by Major T.W. Farabee at 09:15 from an altitude of 31,600 feet. At 800 feet above the target, the equivalent force of 20,000 tons of TNT exploded. Colonel Tibbets pulled away sharply in a 155-degree turn to escape the glare and the blast. The destruction was on an unprecedented scale. Some 4.5 square miles of the city, 48,000 buildings were destroyed, 78,000 people were killed. Following no real reaction from the Japanese, 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, was released over the city of Nagasaki, again from a B-29. Another 35,000 people died in the conflagration. 5 days later, Japan surrendered, and the war was over. The B-29 Superfortress had done the job it had set out to do. After the war, the United States Army Air Force underwent a major restructuring process. In 1947, the United States Army Air Forces became the United States Air Force, the USAF. Much more advanced aircraft were needed. New engines and power plants were introduced. Aircraft with sleek new designs came off the designers' drawing boards. Aircraft that had served well in the war years were being replaced by a new breed of machines. With these new machines came a new breed of pilot. New trainers were introduced to train the pilots. The T-28 Trojan took over where the old AT Texan left off. Man was about to go faster than he had ever traveled before. In In the forlorn sky above the muddy Yalu River that separates Korea and Manchuria, history was written in streaming contrails by a handful of men and machines. The men were the jet pilots of the United States Air Force, competently trained and skilled in handling weapons of war. The machines were the F-86 Sabre jets, which, under the control of these men, registered a fantastic record of downing 14 Russian-built MiG-15s for every Sabre jet lost. The place would come to be called MiG Alley. What happened over MiG Alley between December 1950 and July 1953 confirmed a place in history for North American Sabre jet. A place which it had already earned in 1948 by becoming the first conventional aircraft to break the sound barrier. Having ended the Second World War with its P-51 Mustang, acclaimed as one of the best piston-engine fighters of the conflict, North American built an aircraft that was ready to do the same. America was now ready for the dawning of the jet age.